Brilliant, perfect. So I guess I'll make a start as already introduced. I will be trying to give that perspective of a more social science or environmental psychology perspective of trying to understand what makes sustainable or unsustainable fashion and textiles. So I guess just starting straight away, if I can get the clicker to work, just for a moment, what do you think of when it comes to fashion and textiles? The things or the images that come to mind are probably shops, clothes rails. Some of it may be catwalks and more fashion side of things. You might start thinking about other types of clothing like school uniform, work uniform, or maybe more specialist gear like sports gear and stuff like that. But as many of us already know, textiles are everywhere pretty much, from being in the home. So just this is not my house, Google has shared with me, you've got textiles from rugs and carpets to cushions and sofas to curtains to lampshades. They're all around us at home, in our cars and public transport, and even when we can't even see it, when it comes to things like house insulation and construction work and stuff like that. So fashion and textiles and materials is everywhere around us. And as well as being everywhere, the process of how they are made is a rather complicated one. So you may recognize this diagram. We've had previous talks already, which shows the complexity of the life cycle of textiles, from getting the raw materials in the first place to making it into fibers, which then turns into textiles, which you then can use for actual garment making or whatever you plan to use. Then it's about distribution and selling it, using it. Usage includes buying it, wearing it, caring for it. Then after that, once it's done, what's the decisions? Typically, a lot of our textile waste then goes into landfill or is incinerated. And there is more movement to make this more circular. So trying to recycle the whole product or the materials themselves through chemical or mechanical recycling or just reuse. So that's the process and the cycle of fashion and textiles. But within each of these, there's scope for leakage and release. It could be chemical release, it could be microfiber pollution. Either way, at each of these steps, we are releasing stuff into a natural environment, which I think Kerry's talk a couple of months ago covered some of this. So as well as it being a cause of kind of concern, there's also people behind each of these. So there's lots of different stakeholders involved. Most people think, oh, just a consumer, but actually there's different people with different roles. So it could be the designer, the people who are actually making the stuff, who recycles it, to who enforce and the policy makers and stuff like that. And I guess going back to this life cycle, behind each aspect, yes, there's a technological innovation and engineering and so on, but there's also people. So behind every single step, there's behavior or decisions that are being made. For example, from the raw materials, what materials should you use? Should be using brand new primary materials or using recycled materials? It could be how you make things. So whether or not you use a zip or buttons, or what type of cotton and thread you use to actually stitch it all together, will then impact whether or not it can easily be recycled later on, and maybe how well it sells on market and so on. When it comes to distribution and actually putting it on the market, how should it be labelled and advertised and promoted? And then when you bought a product, when you're thinking like a t-shirt or something, how often should you wear it, wash it? How should you wash it? What cycle, what temperature, and so on? And then once you're done with it, what should you do with it? Should you just put it into the bin? Is it going to go into a charity shop? All those decisions. And each of these decisions then has an impact on whether or not that textile waste has an impact on the environment, on the economy, but also on society. And this is where social sciences are needed. We need to bring in that human dimension to understand these decisions and behaviours. So social sciences, they are still a scientific study, so there's still experimental aspects to it. But there's so many different social sciences. So there's human geography, sociology, looking at the more community group level side of things. You've got economics, but then there's also psychology. So this is where I come in. So for psychology, this is very much the study of human behavior. Why do people act and behave in a certain way? As well as being called psychology, it's also referred to as behavioral studies or sciences. Within this, there's lots of different subdisciplines. So you've got the biological psychology, which is more about how the brain is functioning. You've got cognitive and how people process information. Developmental, about how you change across the lifespan. Social, about how you interact with social groups. And then applied psychology. And this is where we're very much focused on using psychological theory, methods and findings to solve very practical problems. There are different types of applied psychology, but this is where I specialize. I focus on environmental psychology. So within this, environmental psychology is the science and practice that investigates the relationship between people and their physical environments at the individual small group level. So that's psychology is very individual, things like sociology is more group level. And within this, we're looking at how the environment impacts us, but also how we impact the environment. So this is very particularly relevant here to understand why we behave in certain ways that then impact whether or not the fashion and textile industry is as sustainable as it can be. And so with this, we do use a big fan of conceptual frameworks or theories to guide our scientific inquiry. We use a range of quantitative and qualitative methods. It's very applied focused, so problem and solution focused, and it involves working very closely with other disciplines and sectors. So I'll now just very briefly summarize some of the work that we're doing within this context. But emphasizing that third point in terms of teams, this is not an individual element. It does need to come with working across different disciplines as well as different sectors. So this was a nice diagram that I think really nicely demonstrates the different types of working. So you've got the disciplinary, working within your disciplines. So you just focus on your disciplines, focus on a single goal, whereas multidisciplinary approaches, you're tackling slightly different goals depending on your discipline. Interdisciplinary, if I can say the word, interdisciplinarity, close enough. You have a common goal, but you're coming at it with different perspectives and your different methods and approaches. And then that transdisciplinary focus is where you bring in non-academics, non-disciplines to bring in, say, the business side of things. And so working across Network Plus, we are doing just that. We are bringing in that psychology, social science perspective. So many of you've already met both Katie and Shelley, who are actually doing the bulk of all of this work. And we've also got Greg and Eve, I think Eve's on the call as well, helping with the social science part of things. Then we're working with Max and Richard from the more environmental marine sciences, as well as Angie and Jane when it comes to the more textile and biotech side of things. And then, of course, with industry, to actually make it relevant and appropriate, we've got, and we'll talk a bit more about circular flow with Peter, and then, of course, Plan B with Tim. So by bringing all these different disciplines together, we can get a bit more of a holistic answer to these questions. So I'll just briefly run through 3 of the projects that we've got going at the moment, with 2 of them. The first 2 are Future Fibres Network funded, and then Spores and Shores is funded by the recent PCT, the Programme Coordination Teams Plus pot, and focusing much more on the social science, what we're contributing to these projects. So first, enhancing circularity in the surfing and diving industry. Well, the problem here is that when it comes to surfing and other water sports, there is a big need for neoprene and wetsuits. But the problem with this is that as well as having lots of environmental impacts in how it's produced, so the climate change impacts of basically petroleum based product and the chemicals and stuff that's released, there's also no way of recycling it. The main way is either to be burnt or landfilled, and it's estimated about 380 tons are burnt or landfilled every year. So we are producing a lot of waste, very specific neoprene waste. And this has knock-on impacts. Yes, it's taking up space in terms of landfills. There's the release of chemicals, both at production, but also at the waste side of things, greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, that then has impacts on wildlife. There's microplastic pollution and also the air quality, especially if it's incinerated. So we need to address this. We need to try to work out how can we make neoprene more sustainable or more circular. And this is where Circular Flow comes in. So Circular Flow has already built a factory in Bulgaria where they actually found a way to actually recycle wetsuits. So they collect relatively clean wetsuits. They then put it through the factory to then make neoprene, a new type of neoprene, which can't be made to the level of another wetsuit because it doesn't have all the same properties, but still can make really useful neoprene products. So from things like yoga and bike mats to flip-flops to your your laptop case or bag and stuff like that, to even construction things like when you think like insulation in cars and stuff like that. So we can give it a new life. So that's the potential solution. But what we're doing is trying to understand, can we increase the scope of this? Can we build a factory in the UK? Is there going to be enough demand and interest in this? And that's where the science or the social science comes in here, where we are looking at consumers. This one's very much focused on consumers' willingness to actually purchase materials that are made from recycled material, but specifically neoprene. And with this, we're taking two approaches. We've got a survey underway, which is collecting quantitative data, so how people respond on lots of Likert rating scales. And then we've also got in-depth interviews. And with this, the interviews are already done and finished. And Shelley, if you came to the meeting last Tuesday, Shelley gave an update on that. And just very briefly, some of the main take-home findings from this is that when it comes to surfers and water sports people, their focus is, when it comes to buying a wetsuit, buy well and buy once. So they try to buy what the best they can afford at that moment in time. They're also very much aware, so our group of 14 interviewees were very aware of the negative impacts that wetsuits and neoprene can have, and felt quite self-conscious because of it. And then this links back to the positivity side of things. So they were definitely excited and enthusiastic about producing something which helps to counter those earlier negative things. So are willing to go out their way to buy something which is made out of recycled or old wetsuits. So there was definitely an appetite from those 14 people we interviewed. But that's one of the points when it comes to these different mixed methods approaches. Qualitative interviews can really provide really nice in-depth information on why people behave in certain ways, and can really unpick what is it about it, why, what would stop them, what would encourage them to buy more products. But their findings are never generalizable. You can't say, based on these 14 people, the whole UK will think like this. They just give an insight from that sample, and therefore you need to work with other methods like surveys to try to get more of a general trend. So using big questionnaire surveys allows you to get a broader sample. So we're going to have 1,000 people who are nationally representative. So they're representative in terms of age, education, gender, and so on to the UK population. And we can try to unpick those more general trends. But likewise, they're quite superficial. We can't provide that depth. So together, when you bring in the more qualitative and the quantitative approaches, you can get An understanding of what are the key drivers of behaviour, especially when it comes to the survey, but then you can also understand a bit more on why and how to use that information by having more in-depth exploration using interviews. And so with the survey, how we're trying to do this is we like to use theoretical frameworks or theories to try to guide what we ask. So based on previous studies and previous work, we know that certain drivers of behaviour influence how we act. The very basic version is the information deficit model, which argues you just need to make people aware and therefore they'll change their behaviour. Well, I think we all know that is not the case. We're not as simple as that, unfortunately. I think how many of you, or maybe your children, know that you should be eating 5 bits of fruit and veg a day, and then how much do they actually do? So this is too simple. Other factors influence us. It's not just about knowledge. So what we're trying to understand, and is relatively new in this area, is trying to unpick what exactly is the key driver or drivers of why people act in a certain way. And so with this, using we call the COMBI model, we're trying to unpick that a bit further. And COMBI stands for three things: compatibility, opportunity, and motivation. COMBI. And so with that, we're looking at, when it comes to capability, it's more about people's psychological as well as physical capacity to engage in the behaviour. So this is things like, do people know how and where to find items made out of recycled materials and recycled neoprene? Are they aware of the consequences that their behaviours have? Do they have physical access to it? And do they believe they can do it? That's going to be another thing, is do people feel they have the ability to actually perform that action? Opportunity focuses much more on those external factors that enable or hinder the behaviour. So this could be what other people are doing, so social norms, your personal norms of whether or not you feel morally obliged to act in a certain way. Availability, is it even in the shops that you go to, and can you afford it? And finally, here we've got motivation. And this is often shown in psychological literature to be a massive driver of people's behaviour. So it's that area of concern. Do you even care about it? What's your values? How important is this? What's your attitudes? And also there's skepticism in terms of, can you believe what the labels are saying? Is it really as sustainable or recycled as it claims to be? And then, of course, there's things like brand loyalty. If you always buy from a certain brand and they don't sell it, then that makes it difficult to actually to do that behaviour of buying recycled materials. And another thing to include here is the influence of habits. So all of these other elements are quite a deliberative thing. It takes thinking and planning and stuff. But actually, the majority of our behaviours are actually quite habitual. You just do things without really thinking about it. So you need to buy a new t-shirt and you just happen to go into that shop because you always go there. You don't consciously think, oh, I must go to shop X. And so we also need to consider and control for our habitual behaviours as well. So with this project, we'll hopefully unpick a bit more what drives our behaviours. Well, with our data, we'll be able to highlight which of these points are most prevalent and important when it comes to buying. We're focusing on recycled materials as well as recycled neoprene in particular. And then with that, combined with the interviews, we'll be able to actually start to highlight, are consumers actually interested and willing to buy products made from this? So is there an argument why we need to have this factory in the first place? What are the main reasons or barriers for making these purchases, so that we can address that in terms of the designing side of things or how things are advertised and promoted? And then ultimately we can use this to actually influence and make the product ready and relevant. It's not only being ready, but it's relevant and of interest for market and society. So that was the one on neoprene and wetsuits. Another project, which again, apologies if you went to the meeting on Tuesday, you heard Max talk about the polyester recycling. So as he highlighted, and I stole those from his slides, at the moment, a lot of our textiles, especially when it comes to polyester, is very linear. Most of it, once you've finished using it, that's it. And there's not much circularity. It doesn't really come back into that life cycle. And so what Plan B is trying to do is to make that circular, to collect polyester clothing and materials like dressing gowns and so on. Max and the team are focusing on how much it needs to be cleaned for that it to then go into the factory to then be recycled and be made into those textile materials again, which can then in turn be made into more clothing, which the intention is to be then recycled and recyclable, so it stays within that circular loop. So that's the solution. The science, or rather Max is also doing the science, the social science that Shelley's leading on, is looking at understanding what those barriers and motivations and facilitating factors are for industry. So when it comes to like brands, why are they not using recycled materials, or what would make them, or what's their current perceptions or shortcomings that they feel need to be addressed in order to make this more common practice. And so with this, she's running interviews about to start, which only take 30 minutes, doesn't have to take long. It could be 10 minutes, or if you want to talk for hours, you could. Shelley probably wouldn't like me for saying that. And just as a thank you as well, there's a bit of a £10 shopping voucher for taking part. It's also a bit of a shameless plug as well. So if you want to participate or know people who are relevant and interested, then I'm sure Shelley would be very happy to hear from you. So that's to get the industry's perspective on why we cannot do more polyester recycling. But we are also then doing work on consumers. Rather than interviews, which like we've done in the previous one and with the brands, where you get a much more one-to-one basis, Shelley is running focus groups with Eve, where they are bringing consumers together to get a more collective perspective and understanding, and you can get different ideas and kind of snowball thoughts when you're in a more group dynamic. And with this, bringing consumers together, we'll go through 3 main steps. So first of all, it'll be reflecting on their current journey when it comes to buying a clothing item. What do they look for? Do they pay attention to labels? How do they then use it, wear it, wash it? And then what do they do at the end of the life cycle? There's going to be a nice discussion about clothes labels and how lots of different companies label their materials and stuff in different ways. What do people actually understand? Do they pay attention? Do they care? What do they think they mean? And so really looking at that understanding perception. And then we'll conclude with focusing on their perceptions and understanding of materials made out of recycled clothing. So there's often that discussion within industry, but also when it comes to consumers and other groups of people. Different words have different meanings. And the distinction between recycled, something that's already been made up of something, versus recyclable, which has a process and the opportunity to be recycled at its end of life, all have slightly different meanings and connotations to different people. So we'll be looking at that, but through actual physical examples. So what's their perceptions of buying like trainers and clothings made out of recycled bottles, for example, about other materials, or even when you think about those maybe not so clean looking duvets and pillowcases from the Salvation Army and stuff. Do people mind if their clothes and materials are made from these things? And once we know that, we'll, again, similarly as before, we'll get an understanding if consumers are interested and willing to buy these products made of recycled materials. Are brands and industry partners interested? So we're definitely bringing in that industry perspective. And again, understanding what are those main reasons for making such decisions, and what can we do to overcome that to make it much more common practice and make the system more circular. So that's the 2 which are underway. And as of Tuesday, we're starting, once contracts and stuff are signed, we'll do our third project as part of the Network Plus funding, which is looking, great name by the way, Shelley, Spores and Chores, looking at consumer perceptions of biotic textiles. So with this is focusing on one of the main problems here is perma-stink. Don't know if you've come across this term before, but it's that persistent, unpleasant odour lingering on clothes. So it could be things like towels and stuff which just smell damp, or more commonly it's things like sportswear and stuff where it doesn't matter how often you wear it, it still has that kind of musky, doesn't matter how often you wear it, how often you wash it, it still has that kind of musky smell. So the solution which is being explored within another network, Future Fibres Network funding, is the Fabriotic project. Again, Angie and team talked about that on Tuesday. So this is where they're looking at using biotics, the science, that side of science I don't understand, but putting stuff on the clothes to actually make it last longer and not smell and address that perma-stink. So whilst they've been exploring the textile and the microbe side of things within this project, what we are doing in this add-on project is looking at especially the social side of things, the consumer uptake and willingness to have clothing materials out of this covering and coating. I'm trying to understand a bit more. So what are their perceptions of biotics? Yes, we have yogurts and stuff with it, but it's also on lots of different clothing and textiles and stuff already. Are they aware of it? What do they think it means? Would they be willing to buy stuff actively with this, be it detergent or clothes which already have this stuff on it? And also, how would they care for it? So something which was mentioned in one of our previous meetings was about like over specification. So we can have all these great innovation and great tools to make this, address this problem, make things not smell so much. But we need to work with human behavior. If people wash the items as much as they used to at temperatures or things that aren't going to help these biotics, then you've over specified your materials and stuff to not make the most of it. So it needs to be done hand in hand. So if you're putting these biotics on the clothing, it needs to be cared for in a certain way to make the most from it. And so with this, we're using interviews to try to explore that a bit more, see if people like the feel of it, would be willing to actually buy and care for it in the appropriate ways. And with this, again, looking at people's willingness, we'll also be trying to work with Max, Angie and Jane and Richard to identify what's the key framework that we need to use to assess the effectiveness of this and similar innovations going forward. So from the social science point of view, what are the metrics that need to be considered in terms of the intended and unintended consequences? So are people going to change their behavior to care for it and look after their textiles appropriately, but also what are the environmental and economic impacts of such innovations? So I guess the main message I wanted to say during this was the importance of people. Psychology and social sciences are there to help make fashion and textiles more sustainable. You need to involve the people. This can be understanding people's behaviors and decisions from across the life cycle, from understanding the designers, how they've designed or sourced their materials, or how they've decided how they're going to make certain garments, to even the consumers, what makes them buy certain things and care for things. Once you know how people behave or why people behave in a certain way, then you can also then use behavioral sciences and psychology to encourage more behavior change. So target those main drivers, main things that influence people's behavior. If you know that cost is important. Obviously, you need to assess and make sure it is viable financially. But also, if it's really important in terms of social norms and what other people are doing, it means that your marketing really needs to emphasize that. So with this information, you need to know their baseline, but also try to address and target those key aspects of why people behave in certain ways. I think that's then everything. So if you have any questions, I think the recording will stop or be cut so we can have a discussion. If you have any further questions afterwards or want to contact me, please do. Thank you very much.